You've landed on The Substance. I'm your host, Philip Marinello, saying welcome back. Here at The Substance, we're looking to have conversations that help us all better appreciate goodness, truth, and beauty. Previous guests include folks like Film Spotting's Josh Larson, Tyler Huckabee, Megan Abbott, actor-director John Carroll Lynch, and the Flophouse's very own Dan McCoy. This week on the show, we are very excited to welcome back New York Times film critic and author Alissa Wilkinson. Several years ago, we had Alissa on to talk Greta Gerwig's Little Women, and quite a bit has happened since then, so we're very excited to have her back. She's promoting her new book, We Tell Ourselves Stories, Joan Didion and the American Dream Machine. It's a really wonderful book. You're going to want to pre-order it. Tell your local libraries to order it. This is one to definitely look out for, and I'm so glad we were able to have her on for this. Quick bit of business before we get to the show. If you are not operating a motor vehicle right now, we ask that you open up whatever app you're listening to this podcast on right now and hit 5 stars. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, maybe take a minute and write us a quick review, a sentence or two. It really helps new people find the show, and we appreciate it. And now, here's my conversation with Alissa. Well, Alissa, welcome back. It's been a while, but I'm so glad our schedules worked out for this one.
Me too. It's great to be able to finally start talking about my my book that I've been working on for so many years. It's exciting.
It is really exciting. And the world is very different. This is your second book that's come out since the last time we spoke.
That's
and
right.
The world has changed very much. The end of 2019 was the last time we had you on the show. Talking Greta Gerwig's Little Women. We were talking about, like, they had just announced Barbie, what we were like speculating on what that might be, not realizing that, 2020 and on was going to be a whole lot of things.
A whole lot.
Before we get into this, I'm excited about your new book. I've read a good portion of it. I love just the focus of your last couple books. But before we get into that, there are a couple things I wanted to talk to you about. This one I wasn't planning on, but just the other day, I don't know what do we call the things we do on Blue Sky? I'm still calling them tweets. I don't know.
I think post is the thing that we've decided on, because there was a brief period of time where people were calling it skeets, but I refuse.
No, thank you.
We're not doing
yeah,
that.
no, thank you.
No.
So I posted on Blue Sky the other day. I've been putting a little bit of my holiday money to use, and one of the things I got was the imprint Scorsese Films on Faith. And I open up the booklet in here. It's a really beautiful little hardcover book, and you're front and center. You're the first essay in that.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen the thing yet. It hasn't arrived at any of my places, but people keep letting me know, so I'm excited about that. I kind of forgot I wrote it. But it was a really,
as you do.
Yeah, it was. I went after I've been told that, so I went back and reread it, and I was like, "Oh, this is pretty good. That's exciting." Yeah, I mean, they contacted me and just said, it's a company based in Australia, and they were like, "Well,
we're real small company out of Australia,
real small company," and had the brilliant idea of putting out a box set of Scorsese's religious trilogy, I guess you could call it, although one might argue more of his films are religious, but those are the overtly ones. And they said, "Do you want to write something?" And I was like, "I would love to." I had to, of course, get permission from my editors and everything, but they said, "Go for it." So I wound up thinking about how Scorsese is transgressive, not really the content of his movies so much as the way his religious movies in particular seem to threaten status quo every time they come out. Whether
every time,
it's getting banned in China, or getting firebombed by some legion of Catholics in France, or even just silence, which seemed to completely confound the Hollywood machine. So that was really fun to write, and I always love writing about Scorsese, especially because I'm writing about him and he's still alive, which is so much more fun than writing about people after they go. So so it was a really good experience.
Yeah, I loved reading it. Did you say you've got a set coming your way? That's a pretty limited amount. I didn't buy one before they sold out on Imprint's actual site, but then when I had some cash, I went on eBay, and there's a couple of really good stateside I imagine they probably just get them. I don't know exactly how their business model works, but they had a
Yeah.
small stack, and I was like, I better get one before they're gone. I think there's only
Yeah.
1,500 of those.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, they're supposed to send me one, but I've like moved and many things have happened in the most recent
Well, I hope you
months.
get it. I was a little hesitant, frankly. I was like, this is the most me set there is, but also I already have these movies and the price tag
Yeah.
is not small, but the box set is beautiful. The book is incredible. There's 3 really
Mm.
great essays. And then there's so many new special features, which is why one of the biggest drums I bang of like Criterion, Kino, Arrow, all these people putting these things out, just like make it worth our while. Like I
Yeah.
like the new cover art, but if it's only archival features, then like we have these movies already.
Right, right. I think a lot of people have forgotten that this is what used to come standard with any DVD that
Any
you
old
bought.
DVD
You
had
would
like
get
2 commentaries and a 45
right.
minute behind the scenes making of. And
Or 6 commentaries. I was doing research on The Matrix last summer for a piece I wrote and just started laughing when I realized one of the commentaries is with Cornel West.
oh, he does. They have a philosopher commentary on all
Yes,
3 of the original
so
trilogy,
great.
and they are great. I was
Yeah.
actually working behind the scenes trying to connect them in Letterbox to produce one for Resurrections, which I don't
Mhm.
remember what were briefly. When I get film people on here, sometimes we talk Resurrections. What was your 60 seconds on Resurrections?
Um, uh, that's the most recent one, right? Or no, that was the 3rd
Correct.
one?
No, the
The most
newest
recent
one.
one. Yeah, yeah, okay,
Only
so
Lana.
that it was goofy because it came out during the pandemic, so whether it's like a real film or something I imagined is sometimes a little,
And day
fuzzy to
and
me.
date on
Yes.
Max, which was
Yeah, I
nuts.
bet their theaters weren't open, I don't think, so I get it, or they weren't open here, in New York, but I think, I really enjoyed it, and I also appreciated and I kind of mentioned this sideways in the piece I wrote about The Matrix for the Times last summer, that I felt like they really nailed down what the series had always kind of been about, which is just, like, love and
Yeah.
like, kinda swoony love. I mean, they're about many, 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 many things, but I think at core well, Lana clearly in particular is just a big old romantic at heart, and I appreciated that aspect of it quite a lot, and I also thought that it was funnier than the previous 3, and I appreciate that too. That's more than 60 seconds, but it was
No,
definitely
that's perfect.
memorable.
I love the film. That's honestly one of my favorite episodes that we put out because that was back when I had 2 other co-hosts and we had a guest, and we were all kind of in different places. So that was a really
Mm,
fun discussion. But I loved it. I thought it was fantastic, and I've rewatched that a lot. That's actually, other than movies that I've logged on Letterboxd with my children, Resurrections, I've got it like 6 or 7 times. That's the most rewatched movie since I've had an account, and
that's
it's
fantastic.
it lands so well. Like the
Mhm,
older I get, I kind of feel bad the less I like Chris Nolan. And Interstellar just had its 10th anniversary, and like
it did.
love is the key of Interstellar, but it is really hard to buy for me. But every time I put on Matrix Resurrections, I was like, yeah, love is the answer. And it works so well. 10 out of 10 in this one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Delightful. Yeah. I mean, it was nice to revisit The Matrix overall, and years ago when I was teaching, I would have my students, in my postmodern theory class write their final paper on The Matrix, anything they
Nice.
wanted having to do with The Matrix, and that meant I had a lot of opportunity to think about various ways into and out of The Matrix, and when you rewatch those movies, they really hold up,
Yes, they
like,
do.
shockingly well.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I came back around on 2 and 3. They're not as much as 1 and 4 for me, but it's kind of an incredible series.
Yeah, it really is. It really
And
is.
the other thing, before we get to kind of the new stuff, I wanted to talk to you about it because, again, it came out in between our last 2 talks. The piece of yours, I loved Salty. I wish we could have gotten you for that. I've given that to a couple people, but the thing of yours that I have personally read the most and shared the most over the years was your Jackass piece. And
Yeah.
coming from you and somebody with your background, you're a New York
Mhm.
person, very serious and faith based.
Well,
Like, I've always loved those
serious might
films.
be very debatable, but yes.
I've always loved those films for very
Mhm,
different reasons 20 years ago or whatever. But when
mhm.
Forever came out, I just found myself like, it's an incredible spectacle. It's very much like modern circus performers, but like I found myself very emotionally invested in forever. And then when your piece came out and like you talked about how you were kind of converted, I was like, yes. So I would love
Yeah,
to hear briefly about your
my
Jackass
experience.
marathon,
I
how that
mean,
went.
yeah, so one of my really good friends is the curator of film at the Museum of the Moving Image, in which is, if anyone's ever visiting New York and wants the best movie experience possible, that is where to go. It's in Astoria, Queens, quickly like 2 stops out of Manhattan. They have the whole Jim Henson archive
Mm.
there, so you can like go see all the old Muppets in,
That is
here.
so high on my New York list whenever
It
it's
is
time to
wonderful, and
go.
their rotating exhibits are always great. One time they had like they had the rotating or the traveling 2001: A Space Odyssey exhibit. They have
Mm.
one of the best theaters in town. Anyhow, he is a very highbrow film guy, but then he also loves stuff like Jackass. And when the new one was coming out, so this is a couple years ago, they arranged for the New York premiere to take place at the museum, and they also arranged to have a marathon of all of them beforehand. Not the kind of side ones, but
Well,
all of
all of them have
the.
like, yeah, the 0.5s where it's basically like
Yeah,
a feature length of the outtakes, which are
exactly. And
fun,
no,
but
like, no, not the, was it Bad Grandpa or whatever
yeah,
that is? That wasn't in there, but it was like one, two, three. I guess that's it. They had
yeah.
it in 3D. Um,
Incredible use of 3D, actually.
Unreal. So I got there well, I messaged my editor at the time. I was at Vox at the time, and I was like, I think I want to do this. And she was like, oh yeah, absolutely. So I went, I sat there. I mean, I think I was there for 12 hours of Jackass. But it was delightful. And also, they are movies I was aware of, because I'm 41 years old. Like, I am the right age for them. And I've been aware of them my whole life, but I didn't really get what they were until I watched them, that way. Like, I sort of had this impression that they were kind of mean and probably misogynistic and all of this stuff. And, you know, occasionally around the edges you spot that stuff, but for the most part, they're like quite good hearted, just dudes doing dumb stuff. And
Very
also,
much so, yeah.
a lot of film people, and I would say this too, will argue that they're kind of a documentary about friendship of these guys, right, over time. So, yeah, there was a really good experience, and I just thought, like, oh, I can kind of see what's going on in here. People can read the piece to see where I went with it, but it's always fun to do a little stunt piece once in a while when you can. But it's especially fun when, it's not like last year there was a, gosh, what was it, 8-hour documentary about Hitler from the 70s playing in New York, and everybody went to see it, and it was sold out, and I went too, but that was a lot less fun than sitting and watching
I would
Jackass,
imagine
of
so.
course.
Yeah, no, every now and then, and I was thinking about this when I was preparing because I was looking at your letterbox stats over the years and then mine, and I think the year that Forever came out, Jeff Tremaine was like my number 2 or 3 most watched director because I rewatched all of them and the point fives and the Bad Grandpas and all that, and
Yeah,
yeah, a documentary about friendship, like the camaraderie. Like,
that's right.
obviously, I laughed and I was disgusted, but like,
Hmm.
I don't know if
And I
I like
screamed a little.
cried, but I was like very emotionally touched by a lot of the things
Yeah.
in the fourth one.
Hmm. Yep.
Just because it's like these guys have been like these guys have been like my dumb older brothers for 20
Yes.
years.
Yeah. And, they've gone through a lot in the meantime. Um, and let's see, Johnny Knoxville and I think Spike Jones were there at the premiere.
Nice.
And, they the way they talk, if you're a movie critic of a certain age, Spike Jones was very formative in particular. Um,
What an interesting guy.
yeah,
I think the year I moved to Kansas City, Bad Grandpa and Her both came out,
Her,
and those were his
and also
movies that year.
he was married to Sofia Coppola, and so there's just like that whole kind of period of American independent film was very important. So it's just funny to see him also doing this. And of course, music videos and commercials and everything, but it was interesting to hear. And then also Johnny Knoxville, just to be like, I will never do this again, only because my neurologist tells me if I have one more concussion, I'll probably die. And
I
so,
mean, obviously I knew that they weren't going to show him dying in the movie, but I
right,
followed
exactly.
the
It's
build
not a
up to the
safe
making
film.
of it. But yeah, like for a while, the behind the scenes stuff that was leaking, they're like, he's in the hospital and we don't know how it's going to go.
Yeah, yeah, but it is the kind of series that I think really there's a lot of dumb and bad and mediocre movies out there, but I think people, I was talking to a group of students here at the paper last week who were in for a visit, and I was saying the kind of fundamental thing a critic has to enter every theater with, and we don't get to choose what we watch a lot of the time, is just this could be good. And sometimes it is, and it's better than dismissing something out of hand just because you think it must be bad. Because it's so popular or because you like heard something about it
It's quote
once.
unquote lowbrow. It's so
Yeah,
funny
it
to see that
definitely
people
is.
turn around, like my parents and my friends' parents, like the way Jackass used to be viewed to now. The critics who are basically like our peers, like elder
Yep,
millennials, talking about them in the same way they do like Chapman and Keaton and stuff. And it's like,
totally.
it's quite an arc that they've been
It
on.
it truly is. It truly is. Yeah, yeah. So I don't know that I would like necessarily recommend everybody run out and watch the Jackass
Certainly would
movies,
not
but I
recommend them to everyone.
certainly not if you have like a 8-year-old boy living in your house, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, I can't
That
wait
just
to show
seems
them to my boys, but they need to be more mature. Like, there's the
yes,
fine line of it's dumb fun, but also
yes,
like these are like life-threatening things. I had a
yes.
friend who loved Jackass and CKY and all that stuff growing up, and he injured himself a ton, like jumping off
Yeah,
roofs and just doing stupid stuff. So
yep,
there is that line of this is
there sure is.
silly, but also you need to be mature enough to handle the
Yes.
juvenileness of it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it was fun to write and it was fun to it's nice to be able to slip that stuff in among the more, serious stuff.
Well, no, I've loved it. I've reread it a number of times, and whenever it comes up in conversation, I was like, "You guys need to read this piece." I've used it to try to sell people on it, but also
Excellent.
I've used it for people who are aware of you and your work and who appreciate you to be like, "Hey, guys, like she's a lot more like you guys should consider this. Like, read this
Yeah,
piece."
I try not to always be writing about serious things if I can help it.
Well, I'm very excited. Whenever you have a new book, how long ago was Salty? I feel like it just came out, but that could just be pandemic time in my
No,
brain.
it came out in June of 2022. So it's sort of
22. Okay.
I think so the new book actually sold to my publisher after a long period of time in October of 21.
Okay.
And then Didion, who is the subject of my book, Joan Didion, died in December 21. And then Salty came out in 22, but this one was already well underway at that point. This one took a lot longer to write.
Well,
Um,
yeah, no, this was
yeah.
a very thoughtful, in-depth thing on one topic versus what was it, like 8 or 9 or 10
Yes. Yes. I was
different
just speaking
essays.
with a friend who's trying to sell a book, and I was like, well, I would really recommend figuring out a way to make your book feel like a collection of essays the first time you write it, because it is so much harder to write a book like this. And it just kind of kicked my butt a little bit. So it's very rewarding, but very difficult.
Yeah. So very briefly, I know your information is out there, and we've had you on the show previously, but for people who maybe aren't familiar with you, just very briefly, you talk about how you came up in fundamentalist homeschool environment, like just brief, like bio, background, faith, education, like where were you coming from, just kind
Yeah.
of personally for these things?
I grew up I grew up in an evangelical church, but in the homeschool community of the 90s, so I kind of got both sides of that particular equation. Um and uh you know, I was a big like reader, but I didn't watch movies or anything like that. And music was a big part of my life in that we played a lot of music and, were very involved in church. And when I started writing, I was writing for mostly Christian publications. This is like the mid aughts. So it was like Relevant magazine.
That's where I think I
um,
found you in
yeah,
I think I found you in Relevant actually.
I
And I
was
was like,
early.
oh, she's got an edge.
Yeah, I was also there for early Paste magazine. They were fairly new. It was an old, Paste when they still printed it on paper. I my first published film reviews were actually in there, and that was a really amazing magazine at the time. It was started by, and is still run by so a group of Christian friends who wanted to create a magazine that wasn't explicitly Christian,
Oh,
or was it
Paste?
trying to be? Yeah, it wasn't trying to.
Okay. Over the years, I've seen a lot of very talented, but people who I
Yeah,
know are like strongly people of faith write in Paste. And I was like, oh, like that's cool.
yeah,
I hope
that
that
was
I
the
can do
original.
something with them one day.
Their original subtitle, and I think it might still be, it was like Signs of Life in Culture or something like that. And they were so cool back then. I mean, I'm not saying anything about them now, but they were really
Sure.
cool at the time. There wasn't anything like that. It was a music magazine that was like well produced, had pop culture coverage. They had stuff on films and books and television, and they also this is how long ago it was. They with every issue, there was essentially a mix CD that was in the in the issue. So when you bought it
Nice.
or it was mailed to you, you got a CD with like 15 new tracks from new artists, or mostly from new artists. So you kind of got a sampling of like what was going on. A lot of the music I listened to, and honestly, a lot of people listened to from the aughts, were on those um, discs first, and you'd have sort of a musician who was signed next to someone who was just like a random. They were based in Georgia, so there were a lot of bands that would like come through Athens where they were. So anyhow, I wrote for them, and I wrote for, gosh, like every publication, and I have always had a full-time job doing something else. I worked in tech writing, I worked in nonprofits, I did a lot of like, I guess we'd call it content writing now, or SEO, search, or social stuff once that became a thing. Um, and then I became a college professor, which I did until about a year and a half ago. The college closed, like many colleges. So now I adjunct a little bit. I got a job at Vox in like right before the 2016 election, and I was there until the end of, I guess now, not last year, 2023, when I got hired at the New York Times because there's a critic position open, and I have been at the Times since November 23. And in the meantime, if you're a writer, you write books because that's just how you sustain a career. So I had written Salty, which was sort of a pandemic project. And then in the middle of the pandemic, I also signed with an agent who suggested maybe I might want to write a book about Joan Didion. She was correct.
I was like, I bet that wasn't too hard of a pitch for you.
No, in grad school, I had written on her, which she would never have known, but I had also written several over the years for like Books and Culture and a couple other publications. I had written like reviews of books about Didion or essays that were Didion adjacent. So I said, oh, that's a great idea. So this is in May 2020, literally May 2020. And I was like, I need a little bit of time to think about what the angle is. And I kind of went away for a couple months. I mean, I didn't go away because it was 2020. I literally just sat in my living room,
Yeah, you hung out
read.
probably at your apartment.
I sure did. I read every book that Didion had written. I had read a bunch of them, but not all of them. And I read a lot about her, and I watched the movies. And at some point, I had a brainwave that there really hadn't been anything on her that thought about her through the lens of Hollywood. And I don't really mean just her time in Hollywood, but I mean the way that Hollywood film and Hollywood storytelling is just the sort of the main theme of her work. It really shapes how she thinks about everything. And then she, of course, moved to Hollywood and wrote there for the rest of her life and wrote a number of movies with her husband. And then, even when they physically left Hollywood and moved back to New York in the 80s, she became more of a political writer. But if you read with a certain eye all of her political writing, you start to see that it's really about her, I would say, growing horror of the fact that the American public sphere, especially in the age of Reagan, who she really didn't like, even though she was very much a conservative, it became more and more Hollywoodized. And the more TVs got turned on American political discourse, the more everyone started producing the discourse for the television, according to tropes borrowed from the movies. So that's really the sweep of the book, is trying to kind of fill in all those gaps, but also give you, like, if you've never read anything about Joan Didion, the book is biographical enough that you'll know a lot about her. But I don't really intend it to be a biography of Didion. It's a cultural biography in which she is sort of the main character. But the other main character is is America. Easy, easy thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is so interesting. I feel like in a lot of ways that has been a conversation that thoughtful, engaged people have been having a lot over the last few years.
Yeah.
We've engaged, and I'm sure you've engaged with as well. You might have even have done something with the relevant. Did you do something with Dr. Dumais when Jesus and John Wayne came out?
We have the same publisher actually, and we know each other. So, her book was actually a comp for mine when I went to the publisher that
Nice.
I'm with. Um, yeah, so we know each other. We haven't done anything together, but definitely there is a lot of harmony between our books, especially because her book is called Jesus and John Wayne, and it's very much about this character of John Wayne. And actually, Joan Didion was quite vocally obsessed with John Wayne since she
Yeah.
was a tiny kid, and that, that's a huge part of her story actually, and so he's a big character in my book too, alongside Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and all these people. John Wayne looms probably bigger than any movie star in her mind.
Well, and that really was interesting to me in this book because,
Mhm.
I mean, as a young kid with my father was a cinephile of that generation. I grew up with so much John Wayne, and actually, I remember, was I in like the second or third grade, and it was the beginning of the year, and we talked about, oh, what's your favorite movie? And I remember writing down on the little thing that I turned in that my favorite movie was The Sons of Katie Elder.
Well, there you go. That was the set that she um I mean, you know this because you've read the book, but people
Yeah,
should
when I
know
read
that.
that, I was like, "Oh, well, like I
Yeah,
haven't
there's a
seen anybody mention Sons of Katie Elder in
right,
forever."
so there's an essay that she wrote called John Wayne: A Love Song, which it is basically the most swoony and least cynical thing she ever wrote, or maybe the least negative. It's just, but it's a set report. She went to the set of The Sons of Katie Elder with her husband, who John Gregory Dunn, who's also a writer, and that was when she got to meet John Wayne, and you can kind of feel that in the writing. But it's also interesting because it's right after Wayne had so Wayne was like very, very, very right wing, and his politics are. He supported the blacklist and things like that in Hollywood.
Yeah,
But
pretty
he
rough
also,
stuff.
yeah, it's not great when you dig into it. Very pro censorship, I would say, but Didion also knew and would have she would have been thinking about that differently by then, I think, in her life. But also, this was after he'd had his lung cancer scare, and I think one of the most kind of unambiguously great things Wayne ever did was use his celebrity and his kind of macho image to encourage American men to go get scanned for lung cancer at a time when everyone smoked like a
Yeah, they're
chimney.
like, "Smoke in order to be healthy."
Exactly, these are the Mad Men guys, and men didn't wanna go to the doctor. I mean, it's gotten a little better, I guess, but it just wasn't manly, and, like, after John Wayne had lung cancer, he was like, "Look, I've had lung cancer, be like me and go get checked out." So, that's pretty great, but also you can sense this nervousness in Didion's writing because for her, Wayne was sort of the image of America,
Yeah, very much so.
um, American bravery. She saw herself very much inside the paradigm of the brave pioneer ancestors of hers who like went to California. Her great 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 I should probably nail this down. Many greats grandmother like barely escaped being in the Donner Party. She just like
Oof,
kind of accidentally wasn't because she married a minister and they went on a different path. Um,
yikes.
to get to California. But for her, Wayne was like kind of representative of all of that and of security and safety. And, you could write a version of this book called just Joan Didion and John Wayne, but that seemed like maybe a little repetitive. And I like, there's a lot more to talk about with her than this one guy.
Well, no, very much so, and it's also interesting because not too long ago, I'm not sure exactly when this episode's going to come out, but not too long ago, we covered on a substantive cinema episode the late career film, the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which was very
Mm,
much. It was so interesting that John Ford and John Wayne together were so drawn to
yeah.
material that's kind of also in conversation with these things, like examining the American myth that those two men specifically had such a strong role in creating. And like they wrote the American myth cinematically, and like the stories we tell, like they were a big part of the
Yeah.
national myth making. And then late in their career, they're like, well,
Yeah.
let's think about this.
Yeah. But it's funny because Wayne would be offered roles that he would turn down angrily because he didn't think the movie was pro-American enough.
Hmm.
And I think one of the craziest movies I watched was oh, what was it called? Now I'm forgetting the name of it. It's like an FBI movie in which big Jim McClane in
Yeah.
1952. He plays this FBI agent who's gonna like fight communism in Hawaii, but it starts with all this documentary footage, and it sort of emerges very early that this film is very pro the blacklist and pro kind of the Red Scare stuff, which is just it's interesting to watch. People don't program this movie
It's like
very much.
literal propaganda, like basically
Yes.
like, hey, like we should make a movie about how great we are.
Yeah, and not just how great we are, but how great HUAC is, and like how great, it is to like accuse people of being communists out of nowhere. So
And
it's
violently
instructive.
deal with them.
Yes. And it's very instructive to watch, I think, just to it'll expand in truthful directions your understanding of John Wayne as a character.
I was also I had a really good chuckle at the beginning where you were talking about, I think it was in the intro or the first chapter, where the how culture at large sometimes misappropriates or misunderstands the we tell ourselves stories
Yes.
sentiment. Talk a
Mhm.
little bit about that.
Yeah, so we tell ourselves stories in order to live is the first sentence of Didion's essay, The White Album, which came out in the 70s and is about the 60s. And it is the start to an essay where she kind of chronicles the what she saw as accurately as like kind of a summer of absolute chaos, the summer of 1969, the Manson murders. There's just all kinds of things going on where the logic of I think looking back at it, we can say the logic of post war America and the consensus has just completely fallen apart. And also the falling apart of her own kind of health, mental health specifically, but also physical health. Um, and so this sentence I have often seen, I mean, I think plenty of people know what it actually means, but a lot of people just kind of take it out of context and use it to say, like, we should this is why writing is important, or like, yay, like tell stories because
The
they help
power
us
of
live.
art.
The power of art. I've seen it like on, if you go on Etsy, you can find it printed onto like a million little plaques to put on the wall or a tote bag or whatever. I've seen people rephrase it into things like read to live. Um, all of which is fine. Yes, we should tell stories. I'm a movie critic. I know this, but that is definitely not what she meant. Because she goes on then in that paragraph to basically talk about how it is a human impulse for us to see chaotic news headlines specifically and try to ascribe meaning to them or try to explain them in some way. So we see just topically the day we're recording this, we see headlines about fires in California, and we tell ourselves, oh, it's because this person failed at their public duty, or it's because this conspiracy is occurring. And, there's like all these ways that we try to explain what we see happening. And she also very specifically later in the essay talks about how we often try to fit them into the frame that the movies have given us. So we see like a murder happen and we think about it in terms of a noir, and that frames how the justice system works, that frames how media works, that frames how we even just conceive of our own lives. um, and she's not saying that this is bad exactly, because she definitely thinks she does it too and talks about that. But she does think it's important for us to recognize that the stories we tell ourselves are just that. They're stories that we are telling ourselves. They aren't necessarily the correct stories. And maybe there isn't necessarily a correct story. So I took that sentence and cut it in half, partly because I just love a title that is kind of a double or triple entendre that sort of
It's a
makes you think
very
about.
good title.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with that. I'm very bad at titling things. I'm fairly sure my agent came up with this title, but just the idea that you know, she this is her line, but also we as Americans, people, Hollywood, whatever, tell ourselves stories in order to make ourselves feel better um, about things. And, a fair amount of the book looks at, like, there's a chapter where we're talking about superhero stories post 9/11 and how they operate in Hollywood, or Westerns, or biker movies, or whatever, movies about women in New York in the 50s who are career women. So, um, ultimately, I kind of wanted to think about, as a film critic, I'm interested in how the movies we watch train us to think about the world that we live in, and how they therefore make us react to the very real stuff that goes on around us, or the people we run into every day, or any of those things. And the more you know about the history of Hollywood, the more you can see how certain kinds of stories get told and certain kinds don't, and who was making those choices throughout the 100-year history or so of Hollywood.
I think that is so fascinating. And like one of the things we've talked about that has come up a lot over the last few years on our show is that of like doubt and hopefulness together. And I thought that
Mhm.
your second quote, I got like three lines of thoughts here. Let me condense them. Your second quote at the beginning, I love it when either at the beginning of the book or beginning of chapters that people use quotes that
Yeah.
go into it. But your line from All the President's Men, Hal Holbrook, the truth is these are not very bright guys and things got out of hand. And just looking how nationally, but also very specifically, a lot of our audience, wherever they currently are or will land on the religious or spirituality spectrum, like we were given stories
Yeah.
that for a very long time, like we didn't know to question, we
Right.
didn't know to doubt. And your chapter on doubt was really interesting, like kind of Joan Didion's, like in the middle of her life period. I feel like culturally, religiously, politically, a lot of us who are trying to stay on the path of the good and true and beautiful, like we're kind of at that, like especially post
Yes.
2016, but or not, rather post
Yeah.
2016, but especially post 2020, when we
Yeah.
really had a chance to sit at home for a while, but then also really see things fall apart. There
Yeah.
were a lot of great documentaries and books and podcasts. And then that rings with a quote like, not bright people and things getting out of hand. Like it just takes one person with power or a platform or the Hollywood dream machine to tell a story.
Yep.
You take it in as entertainment, your guard is down, and then like subconsciously it just kind of cements as like this is our story. Like
Right.
so many times we've had guests on, whether they're authors or advocates, just dealing with the like, how could people who taught me these principles end
Right.
up supporting these people, ideologies and platforms? Like how does that happen? And
Right.
it's bad. It's stories.
It is, and I would strongly recommend anyone pick up Didion's book, Where I Was From, which comes out in, I want to say, 2003. And it's sort of a collection of essays that are sort of memoirish. It's not one coherent book. The first time I read it, I totally didn't get what was going on. This is a long time ago, and of course I reread it for this. And I think it will ring true for a lot of people who found themselves re-examining, I want to say myth, not because I think they're necessarily false, but because they're big stories that tell us the meaning of the little stories. If you find yourself re-examining the mythology that you have lived inside of, I think that book in particular is a really interesting model of a woman being who has written a lot of this stuff in the past, being very public and very vulnerable, but in a Didion way, which is not vulnerable in a lot of people's way, about dismantling myths and how that can really mess with you and how that can really destabilize you, and also how it must be the thing you must do. I think the thing I really have learned reading her work beginning to end multiple times and thinking a lot about her work and her life is that she never denied, like, she never really thought that you can get to where you know the right story for sure. Like, she's as soon as she tells a
That's a
story, she
healthy and humble place to be.
exactly. As soon as she tells a story, she's already doubting that story, or at least examining that story. And that is basically everything that her books are about, and everything that her public work is about. But where I was from is about her rethinking the myths she received about California specifically. And as someone who's like not even a little bit from California, I grew up in New York State and I've always lived in New York State. The mythology is not, it's not the same. There's not actually that much mythology as an upstate New Yorker. But certainly I understood on a visceral level what she was talking about. And there's an essay in there where she talks about how she was selected, I think, in her 8th grade graduation to give like this speech at the graduation as a student. And it was called Our California Heritage. And she has the text. And so she posts some of it and she's like, basically saying like, of course I thought this because this is all I knew, this is what I was taught, this is all I
Yeah.
knew. And yeah, it's absolutely embarrassing to look at now, but it also is very good at showing her what it means to take in a mythology. And if you go all the way to The Year of Magical Thinking, which, was probably her most, well, it was her most awarded book. She won the National Book Award for it, and it became a Broadway play, and a lot of people, including myself, start there. That's about grief and about her husband dying, but actually it's a book about re-examining everything she thought she knew about grief and about death. And she rejected she grew up Episcopalian and she rejected that as a teenager. So that was not something that mattered exactly to her life, but she sure quotes the Bible and the order of service and the Book of Common Prayer a lot in there because um, it is one of the things that she's grappling with. She's even grappling with whether rejecting that was the thing that she should have done or whether she was just buying another myth when she did that.
Yeah, no, as I was reading your book, I want to read a lot of Didion and engage with her work, but the number one on my list is Where I Was From. That seems like
Yeah.
particularly not like being a little vulnerable. Like me personally, I've talked about it on the show. I feel like I was not homeschooled, but I like similar,
Yes.
adjacent.
Yeah.
Like our parents probably thought highly of some similar figures, things like that. Like, but
Hmm.
also me personally, I didn't realize how fundamentalist I was raised because, like, for better, but also for worse, like, I had a pretty phenomenal experience of fundamentalism that I didn't even realize it. Like, I didn't have super strict rules. Like, because both my parents worked, I was a library kid. I read a lot, I
Mm.
watched a lot of movies. Like, I pushed the limits, but like, I mean, my parents let me watch Die Hard on Christmas with them when I was like 10. Like, I didn't have like
Yeah.
my experience with fundamentalism wasn't negative for a very
Hmm.
long time, so I didn't realize it.
Yes. Yeah, and
But then
it's not negative for a lot of people, or it's certainly people who adopt it for a reason. It has somewhat of the same effect that John Wayne did for Joan Didion,
yeah,
which is it's comforting and secure,
a lot
and
of
kind of
security.
a lot of security, and it kind of gives you answers for why things are the way they are, that feel like you've landed on the answer and you don't need to question it, and you can't question it really.
Well, yeah, and that was the like I was always encouraged primarily by my mom, but even by I had some really great mentors. Like I was always encouraged to think critically. Like I was not the kid told to stop asking questions
Mhm.
until like very very further on in the process. I was like, "Oh, like there are some like hard and fast lines that like just kind of seem to be made up by people."
Mhm.
And like
Mhm.
why are these here? So like my deconstruction or whatever, like I I don't even know. Like I was primed for it. It didn't feel like an extreme thing. Like it didn't feel like I was giving up everything because like I was taught to think critically. Like,
Right.
and it's so weird. Like, we've talked about this before with a few pastors and theologians and professors. Like, the people who taught us to think critically and grew up in the Reformed, like, always be reforming. Like, once it got to a certain point, they're like, no more questions. And we're like, you guys were the ones to taught us to, like,
Right.
think about what things really mean and to
Hmm.
ask these questions. And then now, weirdly, like, stop. And
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I know for so many folks, people close to me, that was not their experience. And I don't know, like, I think what she went through in the way, even just with the passages that you've talked about, I think Where I Was From will be a very valuable resource to me. And I look forward to sharing that with others.
Yeah, it's one that I think gets overlooked sometimes because it's a little feels a little specialist. Like if you're not from California, why would you care? But it's because it's, it is a book about California, but it's really not a book about California at all.
Like so many things, it's about America and about stories.
Yes,
I
exactly.
also thought it was interesting your what did you call political fictions? Not too
Yeah.
long ago, you were on the Holy Post, the Esau McCulley show, talking about the movies of the year. And when he asked
Yep.
you about faith movies, you're like, well, not to be too harsh, but like in the
Yeah.
last couple of years, they've pretty much just been political propaganda. And
Yeah.
as somebody who
Or
loves
just whatever.
movies,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, but I mean, so many of them, like God's Not Dead 7, like
Yes.
We the People or whatever. I don't even have a question. Like, not just like let's dunk on dumb, quote unquote, faith based films, but how do you see both the people in your life who maybe are still in those like, how do you see people genuinely engaging with it? Like, I know people like the idea that materials exist that reinforce what they already think,
Hmm.
but how do the critics and the everyman, like, how do you see like the political fictions being weaved today that, like, from an outside perspective, I go like, how could anybody
Right.
possibly take this
Right.
seriously or believe this? But
Yeah.
people do.
Well, I don't, as with many kinds of, I guess, extremely niche or subculture um, films, I don't like spend a ton of time watching those because I kind of know what they are, and every time I do, I'm
Yeah.
disappointed. On occasion, someone will say you should really try this one, okay, but generally, I think what I've observed, the faith-based movie movement as we know it today really has its roots in the Passion of the Christ, making just an enormous amount of money when it came out. Believe it is still the highest grossing R-rated film of all time.
Before Deadpool, it was, yeah.
Yeah, that's right, Deadpool.
But I
Well,
mean,
other
no,
than
when I'm very cynical, I go like, man, I should just get a pseudonym and just crank out some of these
well, that's the
garbage.
thing, right? They're a little bit if you understand how the movie business works, particularly in America, especially in America, it's very much about one thing is successful and then a billion copycats are made. And
Yeah.
that has worked. But the thing about um trying to figure out how to phrase this, I would say the thing about what it means to be a Christian movie in America is that when the Passion came out in I think '04, believe that's right. It was the early aughts.
Yeah, the
I think
early
it's
aughts
'04.
somewhere. I don't remember.
And then there was a few movies that came out around then. The one that like sticks in my mind is Heaven is for Real, which was the one about the little kid who like has a near death
Died and then didn't.
experience, or
Okay, yeah.
that one made over $100 million at the box office.
Wow.
And these movies made a lot of money, not necessarily because only Christians were going to see them, but because a movie like that is quite uh ecumenical, I guess I would say. There was a long
Okay.
line of kind of Christian movies. Well, they didn't call them Christian movies, right? They were called faith-based movies for a reason, because rarely did Jesus come up. Ironically, given they're all kind of after the Passion, they quickly developed kind of a set of conventions, which was like they're inspirational, they mention God, and probably have some scenes in church, and Christian community, all of that kind of stuff. But
Sure.
but they have to, and the older I've gotten, the more I've realized they have to encompass many regional expressions of Christian faith in
Sure.
America. And being a Christian in the South, for instance, is very different than being a Christian in New England. is very different than being a Christian in Seattle or Texas or whatever. And so to encompass all of those, they're very generic about the faith expression. And even the way the churches look, honestly. And so that worked for a while. But what has happened with American Christianity, of course, as we all know, is it's become increasingly politicized. Um, and that's just an observable fact through, just basic social science. And in order to keep making money from the same audience, a lot of, some people have kept making those kind of broadly inspirational films. I was just talking to someone about this recently and remembered that pre-pandemic, but not that far, was the movie that Topher Grace and Chrissy Metz were in, where the kid falls through the ice and also almost dies, and everyone prays for him and he gets
Those are very
better.
similar to the Heaven is Real thing, right?
Very much. I believe Pharrell is on the soundtrack. Like, I think it was
Hmm.
executive produced by Steph Curry. So it's like, that's a very mainstream film. It made a bunch of money, but it's not the one that people are talking about or thinking about when they think of Christian movies. They're thinking of God's Not Dead, or at this point they're often thinking about just like baldly political polemical documentaries, and or documentary. I put quotation marks around that. I think because they're not really, but
Yeah.
um but I think the fact is, when your audience shifts its preferences or its beliefs or whatever, or if you're just trying to capture more of your audience, there's a statistic out there that, there are people who identify themselves as evangelical who are not even Christian. Like, I'm not saying they're not Christians,
Sure.
because I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I'm saying they're like literally Muslim, but they see themselves as being part of a political movement, and that is tied to evangelicalism. And this is just like, again,
Yeah, that
recent,
identity has kind of been subsumed to a
right?
primarily political
And this
thing.
means that the kind of movie that gets produced shifts too. And again, that's not true of all of them. I've seen a couple of movies where even recently, where I was like, huh, interesting. But, to market a movie to a particular very large group of people who have a proven track record of wanting to put their money in your
Well,
pocket,
yeah, because churches sell out theaters in ways like no
churches,
other. I just checked.
yeah.
I had forgot. I knew it came out. The Shack made almost
Oh yeah,
$100 million.
The Shack was huge. And
But that
that's,
was a book.
that's a great example, honestly, because that one was actually considered heretical by a lot of theologians and church
Sure.
leaders, but it didn't really matter because
It was very
it made a lot of,
inoffensive. Like it kind of wasn't
you know
saying a whole lot.
yeah. And I mean, I think I've written quite widely about how I think God's Not Dead is anti-Christian, and I stand by that. But I also think the the best way to make people feel comforted by a movie is to tell them a story they've heard before in which they are the hero. Um, this is why rom-coms are and Hallmark movies are so popular and so incredibly lucrative, because you watch it and you can imagine yourself in the hero's place because they seem similar to you in some way. And you can easily imagine yourself inside that story. And also, they're comforting because you know what's going to happen by the end. And I haven't really seen a Christian movie ever where I didn't know what was going to happen by the end. And that seems to, except,
First
if you use,
Reformed was
well,
surprising. No, I
that's
know.
what I mean. That's not a
Yeah,
Christian movie because it
sure.
doesn't fit the genre. It's something else entirely. Same with Silence or any, Terrence Malick movie or whatever. There's a lot of those movies being made, but you wouldn't call them Christian movies because they're just not
Sure.
in that genre, the same way that like a movie with sports in it isn't a sports movie unless it fits the sports movie
Yeah.
arc. So, I guess that's kind of how I think about it. And movies like that, I would consider critic proof, the way that
Oh
a lot
yeah.
of superhero movies are critic proof, or, rom-coms are pretty, well, not anymore,
Well,
but
just
they
what you
used
said,
to be
like
pretty
Hallmark,
proof.
like every year they crank out
Yeah.
like 20 and the
Yeah.
same people watch them all.
And that channel makes more, it's way more than 20. That channel makes more money than ESPN.
See,
So,
maybe I got to write a Christmas movie for Hallmark or
well,
a
this is actually
rom-com.
my secret retirement plan, is just to go write a bunch of dumb Christmas movies and
Yeah,
see
why
what
not?
happens. But they're also, of course, AI can write a Christmas movie as well as you or I at this point.
Pretty
But
much.
anyhow, the kind of the large point of that is that for critics, it's much more interesting to engage with a movie that wants you to be in dialogue with it, whether you're the audience or the critic. And a Christian movie, as we know it, does not. Like that, they're not. It's not there to provoke questions. The very best ones, and there are some that I would consider good or good enough, might encourage you to go do something good for your neighbor. I'm thinking specifically here of Cabrini, which I think has some issues as a piece of filmmaking, but is about like a true hero who like risked her life to save orphans and went up against the powers that be, and you
Okay.
know and that was an Angel Studios film from last year. So it's got
Yeah, that's
it's got some
the Jim
issues as
Caviezel
far as
human trafficking one.
right, but also produced some of what's that series that everybody loves on
The
TV? The
Chosen.
Jesus, The Chosen. They were early in The Chosen. There's been a lot since then, but I think a movie
Okay,
like that
that's at
that's
least
about a
ethically
historic
Christian. That's ethically
yes,
Christian.
a movie that's about a true, real historical figure who actually did the things that she's supposed to have done in the movie. Okay, great. I'm happy that I mean, people are going to watch it. I'm glad it exists, and it also challenges them. But if a movie doesn't challenge the viewer in some way, I'm not interested in it, whether it's Christian or not. Especially, I mean, I don't really care what the bent of it is.
Yeah,
If you're,
no, I don't think many of our listeners like would ever seek out one of those like particularly Christian movies. Like, yeah, like
no,
they're rough. I mean, there are
they,
great movies being made in dialogue with faith, and it seems like there are a lot of them lately.
yes,
Particularly like
yes,
genre and drama, but like a lot of people are still making vital movies about faith, but then which the good movies that are being made about serious terms that engage with real questions about faith, it is in such high contrast to the stuff that you were talking about, where it's
right,
like this is clearly made with a formula to make people think that they're the good guys,
right.
or even more insidiously to make people think like the others are the bad guys.
Well, that's right. Yeah, and I mean, I literally, and I'm not being facetious, I don't think there's anything wrong with formulaic movies. I like a formulaic movie. Everybody loves some kind of a formulaic. If you tell me you love
Sure.
westerns or you love sports
I
movies,
love
you love
westerns.
formulaic movies. So it's people tend to fixate on the formula part when they're trying to criticize these movies. And I think what you have to think about is like, why does the formula work? And is that good for the soul?
Yeah.
And that's the part that concerns me the most with Christian movies, and the part I've written about is those movies. I think the
That's the how
polemical
they're
ones.
about what they're about.
Exactly. They tend to want to create in you a feeling that you are hated and that you should make fun of and actively denigrate people who refuse to listen to you. And like, none of that is true. It's all a fantasy. But it's a very particular fantasy that can be very appealing. Um, and certainly I would say is anti-Christian. I don't think you can read the Bible and come up with some other answer for that.
No, not at all. I did want to ask you, I don't think I've come across it yet in looking at various chapters of the book. Did you ever get to engage personally with Joan Didion?
Well, she died right before I wrote it, so no.
We've been writing for a long time. I wasn't sure if
Yeah,
previously.
no, I saw her once. I mean, she lives in New York, so people would see her around, but she was not well near the end of her life. She had I believe Parkinson's. So it's just a lot for her to even get out. So she wasn't even doing public events really f- much after about the late aughts. I did see her once. So the New York Review of Books, where she published a lot of her political work, had like a 50th anniversary celebration many years ago. I believe I wrote about it for Books and Culture, actually. So if that site is still out there, if it hasn't been taken down, you can find it. And she was sort of the star of the evening just because she was Joan Didion and people hadn't seen her in so long. And she came out and read her essay on the Central Park Five, which is another essay that is a can't miss, one of the most important things she ever wrote. It is not about what you think it's about at all. People are always shocked when they actually read it. They think it's about wrongful conviction or something, and it's not. It's about something entirely else. I believe it's called Sentimental Journeys, and it's collected in at least one of her books, but possibly two. Um, she came out and read it aloud, and she was tiny. She was I think barely over 5 feet, probably, 85 pounds soaking wet. And she just walked out on stage. She sat down, she read the essay out loud, and then she went backstage. And that was the only time I ever saw her. But uh, she
But what an
didn't.
experience that was.
Yeah, it was pretty cool for sure. And if you want to know what she was like, I actually think the documentary that Griffin Dunn, who is her nephew, directed, which is on Netflix, called, oh, what is it called? It's got another Joan line. Anyhow, it won't be hard to find. Oh, this, nope, I'm not going to be able to come up with it. Sorry, you'll have to find it, but it's on
We'll find it.
Netflix. And in it, he interviews her, and he kind of her, sort of her last remaining surviving family member near the end of her life. So he spent a lot of time with her. And her interviews are very unguarded with him in a way that she basically never was in other public settings. So it's a great way to kind of get a taste of who she was.
That I'm very excited. That might, because I mean that's on Netflix. That'll bump to the very top. I won't even have to
Yeah, let me
that or
find.
put that
Oh,
on
it's
hold at the
called Joan
library.
Didion, The Center Will Not Hold, and it came out in 2017.
The center will not hold. He's had a moment, like he's really had a moment the last few years as well.
Yeah, he's a pretty remarkable actor, and he's been around forever. But it's been good to see him pop up all over the place. And his memoir, which came out last year, is a great book. Just
Ooh,
that
I
he's
don't even know if he put. I don't know if I knew that he put one out.
yeah, it's called the Friday Afternoon Club. Their family, the Dunn family are kind of a big Irish Catholic family from New England, which is basically code for real storytellers. And so
Sounds fantastic.
it's a memoir just full of the most insane stories that are definitely true. And also his father, Dominic Dunn, Nick, was a Hollywood producer, which is why Joan and John even ended up in Hollywood to begin with. And he later in life became a kind of the first true crime writer for Vanity Fair,
Interesting.
with under Tina Brown, and he's very famous for that. He's a very important kind of person in that crime reporting, but sort of narrative. Partly because I believe one of the first things he reported on was the courtroom drama around the man who murdered his own daughter. Um,
Jeez.
so I mean, murdered Nick's daughter, and then he wrote about it. So it's really something. They're quite a family.
Sounds like it. Well, I look forward to checking out the documentary, and I'll see if Hoopla or Libby or somewhere's got the audiobook. I wonder. I don't imagine he read it himself, but that'd be pretty great if he
He
did.
probably did, honestly, because he's such a famous um,
His
author,
persona, yeah.
yeah, or actor. Sorry, yeah, yeah, um, yeah. It's pretty fantastic.
Well, Alyssa, I appreciate this so much. I was glad I was able to get you. Before we do plugs and final talk about the book, we do have one segment,
Mhm.
substance shout outs. You're a critic. What have you been watching, reading, listening to? You can give a few. What
Oh
have you
yeah.
been challenged by, edified by, encouraged by, or just found really fun?
Yeah, it's the end of the year, right? Well, it's the beginning of the year now, but it has just been the end of the year. So I've been doing a lot of, I think of it like cleanup batter, I guess, on
Sure.
everything, finishing up everything I hadn't finished last year, and starting off on what's coming. So, um, let me see here. So I'm starting to watch Sundance movies this week. I can't tell you anything because I haven't watched them yet, but they're also doing a Frederick Wiseman series in New York next month, who is um, easily the most important American filmmaker alive by far. And if you don't know who he is, just go read about him. We've published a billion articles about him at the New York Times, and everyone else has too. But he's a chronicler of American institutions. So I've been watching films of his, and
His is the
that's
one where like all of his films just became available to the public now, right?
they are only available on Kanopy, which
Yeah.
sadly I don't have access to. But he is 95 years old at this point. I believe he's made 55 movies, something like that. And he's incredibly important, incredibly interesting, makes these amazing documentaries. So check him out. That would be my biggest and best recommendation. And I've been reading a lot of books. I'm trying to remember like a good one that I've read recently. A lot of them are just, well, I'll say I'm teaching at NYU this semester, thankfully, and it's a writing course, but we're talking about attention as sort of our topic. So one of my reads or rereads, I guess, is How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell. And I think that book is well worth picking up at this very specific moment, even if you've read it when it first came out, because it was kind of a bestseller. But it's about um it's it's hard to describe it without making it sound boring. But the author is a artist and technologist in the Bay Area, and she writes about paying attention to the world around us, and also about rethinking all of the ways that we order our lives, whether it's our perspectives on work or money or productivity, all of those things. It's a bit of an antidote to the kind of hustle culture that I think, in particularly, a lot of millennials grew up with.
Yep.
Um, but it's broader than that, and it's a little more idiosyncratic than that. And I've just really found it very thought provoking and nourishing, especially over the last year or so. And it was written prior to the pandemic, but I think a lot of us have brushed up against those concepts in the meantime. So I would really recommend that one too.
I know you had your list of your top 10 of the year, but
I
do you
did.
have any either surprises or something? And it doesn't just have to be substantive because it's the brand. Anything where you went in, I know you try to go in like, oh, this could be good, but any big surprises from the last year or two that stand out to you that you're like more people should see this?
Yeah. Um, I mean, my brain is stuck on the end of the year right now just because we've just gotten over the hump. But the one that I keep thinking about is A Different Man, which I believe somebody won a Golden Globe for it
I think
recently. I'm
so.
forgetting. Somebody
But
did.
maybe it's a weird one. I think it was like maybe music or something.
Yeah, it was something, or it might have been a screenplay. I don't know. It's a very good movie. It is about, it's very strange. You should know that going in, but also very funny and very New York. And it is a movie about a man who has facial disfigurement that is like a genetic thing. And he kind of is just going about his life in New York. And then one day, a doctor tells him that there's like this strange new treatment that he can have that will fix it. And he undergoes the treatment, and now he's Sebastian Stan, who is beautiful and very handsome and everything. But then things go really sideways, and it's sort of this interesting meditation on like appearance, and a sort of what society looks at us, but more how much of our pressure on ourselves comes from inside. And it actually came out the same day as The Substance, and I would say it is the better version of The Substance. It's almost
Interesting.
exactly the same story. It is about a man, but I think it has some of the same, without the much of the body horror. I mean, there's some elements, but it's not that kind of a movie. It feels like a indie movie, but like from the 70s. It's very strange, but it really is thinking about some of the same things about self-loathing and about
Sure.
how we absorb these ideas about what other people think about us and then let them ruin our lives. But it's very funny and dark. It's great.
We have a really great film scene in Kansas City, and that's one
Mm,
I feel like that just fell through the cracks. Like for being an A24 movie with Sebastian
yeah.
Stan, like I think it maybe played a week, maybe two. Like I just
Yeah.
had no opportunity. I wasn't able to see it. So as soon
Well,
as it comes out on Blu-ray or it's maybe
it
VOD
is
now, perhaps.
it's you can rent it for a few bucks on all the digital platforms, so you might as well. I don't, Sebastian Stan actually had two great performances. He was really good as Donald Trump in The Apprentice as well, but
I
this one
keep
is just
hearing
a
that.
better
I've
one.
no interest in seeing it to a
Yeah,
degree, but from people I really respect, I hear that it's very subversive in ways you don't expect and very
it
good.
is.
So I'm like,
It is.
all
I
right.
think the first time I saw it, I didn't like it at all, and then I went back and rewatched it, and I was like, actually, this is kind of good. So I think I would recommend it. Maybe once you're get your beverage of choice and get
Sure.
get geared up for it. But it's a very interesting. It's really more about Roy Cohn than Donald Trump in the end. So yeah,
Interesting. Well, I'm very excited to see A Different Man, and listeners, I guess it's, yeah, rentable now, VOD. Maybe check your local
Apple,
libraries.
YouTube, all the places, and it will be on Blu-ray, I'm sure, very soon. As soon as A24 gets their
Yeah, there'll be like a $50 one at the A24 shop.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
So the book comes out in a couple months now from recording. Do you have a preference? I always like to ask authors where people seek it out, how the pre-order system,
I
how you guys would prefer
do.
that to go.
Well, the major thing is please pre-order it. That is good for it's much better for authors than you buying it on the day it comes out. Good to know. The I will say, booksellers have been telling me this, and I don't even know that I really knew this, but they said it is a really good idea to pre-order through your local indie bricks and mortar bookstore. And the
Nice.
reason, if you have one, or your Barnes and Noble if you don't, and the reason is booksellers pay attention to pre-orders, and if they see that someone has, like, if one person pre-orders, they pay attention. If two people pre-order the book through their local bookstore, there's a good chance they'll stock the book, and they might even like put it on the front table, and that super drives sales for the book. So the odd like fact about book sales is that you sell books by selling books, right? The more a book is selling,
Yep.
the more the book sells. So anything you can do to kind of get it off the shelf and onto a table or an end cap or
So yeah,
something like that,
because if it's one thing if you have like 2 or 3 copies on the normal shelf, but when you walk into the store, you're like, oh, there's a stack of like 20 on the
that's
table.
what I
That's
do,
obviously
right?
where your attention goes.
Yes, and the same for your local library. I mean, it's a great idea to request it from the library, especially if you can't afford it. That's fine, I get it. But the library then will probably get a couple copies, and that's good too. So, you know, I'm pro local independent bookstores, and I think it's the only way to make sure that we have free and open discourse in our country. But I think especially supporting them, but also making sure that people see the book exists is great. And it is modestly a very good looking book. I'm very excited about the cover. So happy for people to dig into it and hear what they think.
Absolutely. Well, listeners, pre-order the book. We have two really wonderful, actually, technically we have three, but we have two very wonderful library systems here in Kansas City that I know they have some of your other work. I'll be recommending this one if they don't already pre-order it, but go and support the book. Check it out. Have you recorded an audiobook for it yet? Will that be coming?
I will be recording the audiobook very shortly,
Nice.
so you can get it that way too, and it should be me unless I lose my voice before then, knock on wood. But
Beautiful. I have a lot of drive time, so that's how in the last, I mean, COVID, we did a lot just because we could only sit in our houses and walk around. But yeah, I love the audiobooks, and when the author themselves read it, that's the best.
yeah, yeah, I like reading aloud. I think that's probably why I became a teacher. So so I'm
Love it.
excited to do it.
Well, Alyssa, thank you for your time. Really enjoyed this book. You're always welcome back in the future. You want to talk movies, future books, whatever. Look forward to seeing what you got in the future.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
So there you have it. That was Alyssa. That was a wonderful conversation. And as of I'm recording this outro here right now, A Different Man is actually playing on Max. So if you have Max, you can fire that up and watch it now. I added it to my queue on Max, and I personally can't wait to watch it. So if you end up checking that out, let us know. Let us know if that will be a good substantive cinema episode one day. I've heard a lot of great things about it, and I'm very excited to watch it. There will be links in the show notes to purchase her book, but as Alyssa said, if you're able to and have a good local brick and mortar bookstore in your neighborhood or within a short drive to you, it's a really great idea to pre-order the book through them and maybe have a friend do that as well so that you can let them know that there's some excitement and interest, and maybe they'll order a large amount and even put up a display for her. That would be excellent. As we said at the top, we appreciate everybody who hits that 5-star button, takes 30 seconds to write us a quick little review. But another great way to help us out is to share the show. Who do you know who likes Joan Didion, who's followed Alyssa's work, or who just would like an interesting, stimulating conversation to listen to while they drive or exercise or do chores? Send it over to them. Say, hey, thought you might like this. That's a really great way to help the show. And if you enjoy and want to support the show, curated conversations with high quality people about art, faith, um, doing good to one another. If that is important to you and you have a couple bucks and you want to support the show, you can do that for, I believe, $1, $5, or $10 a month in the Spotify link in the show notes. Or if monthly support is not your bag, you can hit us at $ the substance pod on Cash App. I know it's a very strange time, and we do not want anybody, it is not a pressure to give, but if you have it and you value what we do here, we would love it if you did that. So Spotify link in the show notes, or $ the substance pod for a one-off, just throwing something in the tip jar. We also want to hear from you. Did you love our conversation with Alissa? Did you wish we asked her about something else? If you have an idea for the show or a movie or a book or a topic, you can reach us over at thesubstancepod@gmail.com. You can either send us an email or record a voice note, maybe 60 to 90 seconds, and then email that over to us, and we maybe play it on the show, interact with it. Would love to. I don't want to go too long here with some of these shows, but would love to do maybe like a mail segment if because I know we're starting to get some of those. So if you have anything, do that, and we might engage with that on the show. Next week, we are back with. It's been about a year and a half since we've done this. Next week, I'm back with former producer and editor Dave. We are talking. We're doing a topic toss-up, and we talk a little bit about the passing of David Lynch. Talk a little bit about just kind of game plan for the next few years of a little bit the show, but mostly just for being thoughtful, compassionate, caring folks living in the U.S., which is where we are right now. So that's good. And also, we talk at the time we recorded it, it was tentative, but we both believed in our hearts about a repeat wager in the chance that there was a Eagles-Chiefs Super Bowl rematch. And as of you listening to this today, there will be. So that'll be very exciting. So look forward to that episode with editor Dave next week. I've been your host, Philip Marinello, saying thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time on The Substance. It's been quite a while since we've spoken
Yes.
previously, and for better or worse, providentially, I have lost both of my previous editors and producers, and now I'm currently a one-man show. I am eagerly looking for somebody to join an independent team. You know how that goes.
I sure do.